Chapter 1. An Invitation to Lower Tilling. The morning light filtered through the crisp lace curtains of Miss Marple's drawing-room in St. Mary Mead, casting soft patterns across her well-polished tea-table. As was her routine, she was seated by the front window, with her knitting in hand and a pot of Earl Grey steeping nearby, when the postman's bicycle clattered down the lane. A few moments later, the familiar sound of letters dropping onto the mat prompted her to set aside her needles. Rising with the deliberate grace of her years, she retrieved the post and returned to her chair, placing the small stack of envelopes neatly on her lap. Bills, a catalogue, a note from her nephew Raymond in London, and one other standing out from the rest. It was an envelope of heavier paper, ivory in hue, sealed with dark blue wax, pressed with an unfamiliar insignia. A stylized church steeple, beneath a crescent moon. Miss Marple regarded it with mild curiosity. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, and unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, unfolding the single sheet of stationery within. "My dear Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive this unsolicited letter. We met briefly, perhaps too briefly, at the Bishop's Garden Fête in 1929. I am Beatrice Lonsdale, now residing at the vicarage in Lower Tilling, where I have long assisted Reverend Julian Fortescue with his affairs, both domestic and clerical. Write to you in great distress. The Reverend has vanished. He left the house on the evening of the 4th of this month, and has not been seen since. The authorities believe he left of his own accord. Some even speculate scandal or mental decline. But I do not believe that. I am certain something is terribly wrong. There have been strange occurrences of late. Doors found open in the night, candle wax where no candle was lit, and a study that remains locked, though the vicar alone held the key. I recall your reputation, Miss Marple, your wisdom, and your remarkable eye for truth. I hesitate to impose upon you, yet I believe your presence may bring clarity to this situation. Should you be willing, a car will be sent. I do hope you will consider my plea. Yours in deepest hope, Beatrice Lonsdale. Miss Marple read the letter twice before folding it and placing it on the table. She gazed out the window, her expression unreadable, though a spark of alertness had appeared in her pale blue eyes. She had met Beatrice Lonsdale once. A woman of refinement and quiet strength, known in certain diocesan circles as a capable assistant to several clergymen across the county. Lower Tilling itself was a small, ancient village some miles east of St. Mary Mead, tucked among low hills and hedgerows, with a stone church nearly as old as England itself. The letter's contents stirred something within her, a sense of disturbance beneath the surface of the ordinary, that particular tingle she always felt when a seemingly quiet place revealed cracks of something deeper. She had heard of Reverend Fortescue as well, a scholarly man, gentle and devout, with a fondness for antiquarian sermons and the occasional Latin quotation. Not a man to vanish without a word. Curious, she murmured to herself, fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. Quite curious. The next morning she posted a short but courteous reply. She would come. 2 days later, a dark green motor car, rather grander than Miss Marple thought necessary, pulled up before her ivy-covered cottage. The driver, a solemn-faced young man in a dark coat and cap, helped her into the car and placed her modest suitcase in the back. As the village faded into the hedgerows and the landscape rolled on in waves of browning fields and autumn foliage, Miss Marple sat silently, hands folded in her lap. Her eyes, alert and watchful, took in every detail as the scenery changed. The trees grew denser, older, their roots raised like knotted fingers across the road edges. The sky turned sullen, heavy with cloud. By the time they approached Lower Tilling, a light mist had descended, casting the village in a dreamy pallor. The car passed a stone bridge, a war memorial, and the modest row of shops that formed the village high street, before turning onto a narrow road flanked by tall hedges. At the end stood the vicarage, a fine old building of weathered stone and slate sitting beside the much older St. Luke's Church, whose tower rose into the mist like a sentinel. Ivy covered much of the vicarage walls, and the narrow windows glinted faintly in the weak daylight. Smoke curled from one chimney, and somewhere within a clock chimed the hour. The driver pulled to a stop before the house. The wooden front door opened almost at once, and a tall, silver-haired woman stepped out to greet her. "Miss Marple," she said with palpable relief. "Thank you for coming." "Miss Lonsdale," Miss Marple returned warmly, taking the offered hand. "I do hope I'm not too late." Beatrice Lonsdale's face was composed, but her eyes were shadowed. She led Miss Marple inside, past a narrow entry hall, and into a sitting-room furnished with dark wood, bookshelves, and the distinct smell of camphor and polish. A fire burned, low in the hearth, more for comfort than necessity. "Tea?" Miss Lonsdale offered. "Gladly." As the maid brought in a tray, Miss Marple observed her quietly. The girl, young, no more than 20, had red eyes and trembling hands. Miss Marple filed that away without comment. Once tea had been poured, Beatrice began. "It's been 9 days now since Reverend Fortescue disappeared. He left the house in the evening. Told me he was going to the church for quiet reflection. He often did so after supper, but he never returned." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Was anything unusual that day? A storm had passed the night before. Nothing dramatic, but it made the electricity flicker, and it left branches down across the churchyard. He seemed preoccupied, but not upset. He took his Bible and a lantern, and said he would be back within the hour. And when he wasn't, I waited until nearly midnight, then searched the church and the grounds. There was no sign of him. I contacted the police in the morning. Miss Marple tilted her head. "And they believe he left of his own accord." Beatrice's expression tightened. "Yes, they found a few unpaid bills in his study. Nothing excessive. Some suggested he may have had a crisis of faith." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "How very convenient." Beatrice hesitated. "There's more. The study. The door was locked after he vanished. I assumed he had the only key. But 3 nights ago, I found it ajar. A candle had burned down to the holder on his desk, and a damp patch was on the stone floor, like someone had tracked water in." Miss Marple sat forward slightly. "And no one had access to the key?" "No. It hung on a chain around the vicar's neck, always." "And was anything taken?" "His dispatch box, the one where he kept private papers. It's gone." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "And you're certain it wasn't moved before he vanished?" "Positive." "Has anyone else left the household since?" Beatrice paused. "Our gardener, Thomas Bridger. He handed in his notice 3 days ago, quite suddenly. How interesting," Miss Marple murmured. They were interrupted by the entrance of a striking young woman in her 30s, dark-haired, elegantly dressed, with a somewhat aloof manner. "This is Margaret Fortescue," Beatrice said, "the vicar's niece." "Miss Marple," the woman said coolly, extending her hand. "I hear you're here to uncover ghost stories and village nonsense." "I'm here," Miss Marple replied mildly, "to discover what truly happened to your uncle, if indeed he disappeared at all." Margaret gave a tight smile. Good luck with that. After she left, Miss Marple was shown to her room upstairs, a modest but comfortable space overlooking the overgrown garden and the old graveyard beyond. As she unpacked, her mind began weaving the threads together. A missing vicar, a study mysteriously opened, a dispatch box gone, a servant who left suddenly, and the unmistakable sense that everyone in the household carried a secret. It was not ghosts that troubled Lower Tilling. It was people, and Miss Marple knew people very well indeed. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Nave. Miss Marple rose early the next morning, as was her custom, and dressed herself in a serviceable grey tweed skirt and soft pink blouse, fastening a silver brooch at her collar. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that the best observations came in the quiet hours of the morning, when most people assumed no one was watching. The vicarage was silent when she emerged from her room. The maid had not yet begun the breakfast service, and the grandfather clock in the hall chimed softly. 6:30. The stillness was almost monastic. Only the creaking of the floorboards beneath her sensible shoes broke the hush as she made her way through the narrow corridor. She passed the study. The door shut once more. She paused, noting the worn brass handle and how it gleamed just slightly more than the others in the house, as though it had been recently used, polished not by the housekeeper but by anxious hands. Miss Marple moved past it for now, continuing down the narrow hall to the side door that led to the small cloister between the vicarage and the church. The stone path was slick with dew. The morning fog curled around the gravestones like a living thing, wrapping around the church's ancient stone buttresses with a kind of reverence. The door to St. Luke's was unlocked. She pushed it open gently, the heavy oak groaning under its own weight, and stepped inside. The air within was cool and still. Dust motes hung in slants of light, filtering through the stained glass windows. The pews were empty, their wood dark and gleaming. The nave stretched forward into the chancel, where the altar sat bathed in gold and crimson hues from the rising sun. Miss Marple walked slowly between the pews, her gloved hand trailing lightly along the wood. A sense of hush filled the space, but not a peaceful one. There was tension here, as though the church itself had taken a breath and had yet to exhale. She paused at the lectern. A Bible sat there, its ribboned bookmarks neatly in place. Beside it, a candle, extinguished but with fresh wax clinging to its base. She touched it lightly with one gloved finger. Still pliable. Someone had been here recently. She stepped forward into the chancel, peering around. On the flagstones near, the altar rail, a faint smear. Mud? No, darker, more like damp soot. She knelt, careful not to disturb it, and saw a partial footprint. Too large for a woman, too heavy for a child. Someone had tracked something through the church, and very recently. She stood and moved to the vestry door. It was locked. Just then she heard the faintest sound, the creak of a floorboard. Not within the church proper, but near the rear, a side chamber behind the organ loft. Miss Marple turned carefully and began to walk, her footsteps slow and deliberate, muffled by the thick carpeted runner. The chamber was dark, the blinds drawn, the only light a flicker through the slats. She opened the door a crack. The room was empty, but something had been disturbed. Papers on the desk sat askew, and the drawer beneath the writing table was open. She stepped closer and saw a torn piece of paper, hastily crumpled and dropped between the desk and the wall. With care, she retrieved it. A page torn from a notebook, half a sentence scrawled in a masculine hand. He said if I told anyone, it would ruin everything. I must keep quiet. She folded it and slipped it into her handbag, lips pursed in thought. Miss Marple did not believe in ghosts. She believed in secrets. And someone in Lower Tilling was hiding something very carefully. When she returned to the vicarage, the household had begun to stir. The smell of fried bread and coffee wafted faintly from the kitchen. Miss Marple removed her gloves, set her hat aside, and entered the dining room where a simple breakfast had been laid out. Beatrice Lonsdale was already seated, dressed in a muted grey dress with a brooch at the neck that Miss Marple remembered from their earlier acquaintance. Her manner was composed, but her eyes were tired. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, pouring tea into the older woman's cup. "I do hope the room was warm enough." "Perfectly," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat. "And the early morning light over the church is most inspiring, though I did notice the nave was open rather early." Beatrice looked up sharply. "Was it?" I asked Margaret to ensure the doors remained locked after dusk. "For safety." "Perhaps someone forgot." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Or someone had a reason to enter when no one else was watching." Beatrice hesitated. "You think someone from the household?" "I think churches, like vicarages, have many doors," Miss Marple replied gently, "and many keys." They were interrupted by the arrival of Margaret Fortescue, the vicar's niece. She was dressed immaculately in dark blue wool, her hair tied back, her expression unreadable. "Miss Marple," she said coolly, "have you discovered any floating spectres yet?" "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But I did find a footprint near the altar." Margaret stopped mid-step. "I'm sure it was the sexton. He's a dreadful shuffler." Miss Marple smiled. "Perhaps, though I gather the sexton is in hospital with a broken ankle." Margaret's lips tightened. "What are you implying?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "I never imply, my dear. I only observe." Margaret excused herself stiffly a moment later, disappearing into the hallway. Miss Marple noted the speed of her departure with quiet interest. Had she always lived here? She asked Beatrice once they were alone again. "No," Beatrice said with a sigh. "She arrived 2 years ago, after her father passed. Julian took her in. She has no other family. I had hoped, well, that the vicar might consider her as his heir, but he was always somewhat distant about such matters." "Did she know of his will?" "I believe so. He consulted Mr. Ives, the local solicitor, 3 weeks ago, though the contents were never discussed in the house." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I wonder if the vicar was planning to change something." Later that morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to the kitchen, where she found the maid, Emily, peeling potatoes with an anxious rhythm. Miss Marple offered to help and chatted idly as she worked. "You were fond of Reverend Fortescue?" she asked gently. Emily's eyes welled up. "He was kind. Always left a little jam jar out when we had extra. Apples, said the Lord appreciated frugality. And did he seem troubled before he left?" Emily hesitated. "He'd been meeting with someone. In the church. Late. A man. I saw him once through the window. Tall coat-collar up. I told Mr. Partridge, but he said to mind my business." "Who is Mr. Partridge?" "The gardener. Lives on the edge of the village." She lowered her voice. "He's strange, ma'am. Talks to himself in the shed." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Gardens often hold more secrets than people realise." "You think the vicar's dead?" Emily whispered suddenly. Miss Marple paused. "I think," she said gently, "that someone very much wants us to believe he is." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the village. The air was brisk, the leaves turning copper and gold beneath her feet. She stopped at the post office, then the small churchyard where the graves of centuries past bore names that had long since faded from memory. One, however, was fresh, the stone unmarked. "An open plot?" she asked aloud. "No, ma'am," came a voice from behind her. The gravedigger, a stooped man with red knuckles and a gap-toothed smile, tipped his cap. "That one's for someone. What hasn't been laid to rest?" Yet? Miss Marple asked. "Body hasn't been found," he muttered. "But the family insists he's gone. Even bought the stone. Seems premature to me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Who was it for?" "Name was Harcourt," he said. "Disappeared near 7 years back. Never did turn up." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I suppose in villages like these, the dead don't always stay buried." "No, ma'am," the gravedigger said, "and some folks try hard to make sure they do." That evening, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage and retired, early, though not to sleep. She sat in her armchair beside the window, watching the old graveyard beyond. At midnight, a shadow moved near the church. A figure, cloaked, moving swiftly along the path from the rear of the church toward the vicarage's back garden. Miss Marple reached for her shawl. It seemed the investigation had truly begun. Chapter 3. The Key in the vestry. The next morning arrived with a silvery haze. The mist had returned, draping itself over Lower Tilling like a veil, softening the corners of buildings and muffling sound. Miss Marple, ever punctual, had risen early and dressed with purpose. Something about the figure she'd seen moving near the church in the night refused to leave her mind. Who had it been? Their shape had been too indistinct to identify clearly, but the movements had been brisk, purposeful, not the wanderings of an insomniac villager. No, this had been a rendezvous, or perhaps an attempt to retrieve something under cover of darkness. As she made her way downstairs, the house was unusually quiet. Beatrice Lonsdale had not come down, and the maid had yet to begin laying out breakfast. Miss Marple walked into the drawing-room and found Margaret Fortescue seated in the window-seat, wrapped in a shawl, staring blankly at the fog-covered garden. "You're up early," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Margaret turned slowly. couldn't sleep. Miss Marple said, settling into the chair beside the fireplace. It was a strange night, full of movement. I thought I saw someone by the church, and her gaze sharpened, though she said nothing. I wonder if it was someone trying to enter the vestry, Miss Marple continued, watching her. A side door leads from there to the old crypt, though it's supposed to be bricked up, isn't it? Margaret stood abruptly. I've no idea, and if you'll excuse me, I've matters to attend to. She left the room without another word. Miss Marple allowed herself a slight smile. She had not expected a confession, but reactions, she had long since learned, were far more useful than answers. A short time later, Beatrice Lonsdale appeared, looking pale. I do apologize, she said. I had a dreadful night. Miss Marple patted her hand kindly. Nothing to apologize for. You've had a great deal on your mind. I dreamed I heard footsteps, Beatrice said, her voice soft, out in the garden, and whispering, like someone praying, but when I looked, there was no one there. Dreams, Miss Marple said, often borrow their material from real life, especially when real life is uneasy. She paused. Tell me, Miss Lonsdale, do you know where the vicar kept the keys to the vestry? On his ring, she replied immediately. He carried it everywhere, along with the study key and the safe box. And the ring? No one's found it, Beatrice said. The police believe he took it with him, if he went willingly. But if he didn't? Beatrice hesitated. Then it's still here. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the church again. The door had been relocked since the night before, but she had borrowed the master key from Beatrice. She moved through the nave, quiet and reverent, her senses alert. The vestry lay beyond the chancel, past a narrow archway, and behind a heavy oak door. Inside, the small chamber was cool and musty. A narrow table stood against the wall, and above it a cabinet where vestments were hung. A battered wooden chair rested by the window. Miss Marple's gaze scanned the room. On the floor, near the chair, something gleamed faintly beneath the edge of the carpet. She knelt and lifted the corner. A key. She picked it up. Old iron, stained at the teeth with age and something darker, rust or perhaps soil. Curious, she murmured. The key matched none of the standard church keys. It was too old. She turned her gaze to the far wall. Stone, flat and featureless at first glance. But Miss Marple had seen old architecture before. She moved to it, running her gloved fingers across the surface. One stone, slightly raised. She pressed. With a slow groan, a portion of the wall shifted. Behind it, darkness. A narrow stairway led down into the depths of the church. The crypt. That evening she dined quietly with Beatrice and the increasingly reticent Margaret. The tension in the house had thickened, like a room left too long without fresh air. You know much about the vicar's predecessor? Miss Marple asked casually. Beatrice blinked. Not really. Reverend Sinclair, I believe, died of a stroke. Did he live in the vicarage as well? Yes, though he kept more to himself. Why? Miss Marple set down her fork. No reason, really. Only I find that churches often carry more than just faith in their foundations. Sometimes secrets rest there too. Margaret rose from the table without finishing her meal. I wish you'd stop talking in riddles, Miss Marple, she snapped. It's exhausting. Not riddles, dear. Miss Marple said sweetly. "Just reflections." That night, Miss Marple waited. At 10 minutes to midnight, she slipped out of the vicarage and crossed to the church. This time she wore a shawl over her shoulders and sensible boots. She unlocked the door with a whisper of movement and made her way to the vestry. The secret door yielded once again to pressure. She lit a small lantern and descended carefully. The crypt beneath St. Luke's was narrow and cold, the air tinged with damp. Stone coffins lined the walls, and broken plaques bore the names of long-dead vicars and benefactors. But it was the far end of the corridor that caught her attention, a low alcove half filled with rubble, and beneath the rubble, disturbed soil. She knelt and examined it. Recent movement. Someone had dug here and covered it again. She reached forward to clear the rubble, when a sound above made her freeze. Footsteps. Someone else was in the vestry. She rose, lantern flickering, and moved silently to the foot of the steps, listening. The footsteps paused, then turned, retreating. Whoever it was had thought better of descending. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. She had seen enough. Tomorrow she would speak to the constable. And perhaps, just perhaps, she would have him bring a spade. Because something had been buried in the crypt of St. Luke's, and she intended to know what. Chapter 4. A second disappearance. The mist had not lifted by morning. It clung stubbornly to the hedgerows and gravestones, swaddling Lower Tilling in a damp silence that made even birdsong seem hesitant. Miss Marple awoke early, but did not rise at once. She remained in bed, propped by pillows, her mind turning over the events of the previous night. Someone else had been in the vestry, while she was below in the crypt. They had not entered, perhaps fearful or merely cautious, but they had come, and that was what mattered. Someone else knew of the hidden passage, or at least suspected its existence, and someone else had an interest in what lay beneath the stones. She dressed without haste and descended to the breakfast room, where she found Beatrice Lonsdale already seated, stirring her tea absently. "You look pale, Miss Lonsdale," Miss Marple said gently. "I had a dreadful dream," Beatrice murmured. "I thought I saw Julian in the garden, walking beneath the yew trees. I called out, but he disappeared into the mist." Miss Marple refrained from mentioning that such dreams were often born of guilt or dread. Instead, she took a sip of her own tea and said, "Margaret not down yet?" Beatrice shook her head. "No, she usually appears by 8, but, well, it's nearly past." Miss Marple stood. "I think perhaps we should check on her." Together they ascended the stairs and walked to Margaret's room. Beatrice knocked gently. "Margaret, are you awake?" No answer. She knocked again. Still nothing. Beatrice hesitated, then opened the door. The room was empty. Margaret's bed was neatly made. Her wardrobe stood ajar, and a small valise was missing from beneath the dressing table. A half-empty teacup sat on the nightstand, and the window had been left open. Miss Marple crossed to it and looked down. The garden path lay directly below, its gravel faintly disturbed. "She's gone," Beatrice whispered. "But why? Why wouldn't she say anything?" Miss Marple's gaze was calm. "Because she didn't intend to be stopped." By mid-morning, word had spread through the village. Margaret Fortescue was missing. Constable Barnes, summoned promptly, arrived at the vicarage looking vaguely apologetic, as though the whole affair had grown far too complicated for a village of this size. "She was last seen yesterday afternoon?" he asked, scribbling in his notebook. Beatrice nodded. "She took tea with us around 4. Said she had letters to write. That was the last time anyone saw her. No carriage called for her," Miss Marple added, "and she hadn't mentioned any travel plans." The constable frowned. "No sign of struggle, no note, and nothing valuable missing except the valise. Could be she left of her own accord." "Or," Miss Marple said softly, "she was persuaded." Constable Barnes paused. "You suspect foul play, Miss Marple?" "I suspect panic," she said, "the kind that follows close behind discovery." Barnes looked uneasy. "You mentioned you'd found something unusual in the church." "I did," she said, "and I believe Miss Fortescue may have known I had." By noon, Miss Marple had returned to the church, this time with Constable Barnes in tow. Together they descended into the crypt, their lanterns casting long shadows against the stone walls. When they reached the disturbed patch of soil, Miss Marple pointed to the partially concealed alcove. "There," she said, "that's where the ground has been shifted." Barnes knelt, examining the area. "Fresh earth, certainly. This hasn't been settled for more than a few days." He rose. "I'll send for help. We'll bring in a spade and proper light." Within the hour, a workman from the village arrived, and with quiet, methodical effort began to dig. It did not take long. Half a foot beneath the surface, wrapped in oilskin and buried hastily, they found it, a dispatch box. Miss Marple watched without comment as Constable Barnes pried it open. Inside, letters, official documents, and one torn page bearing the crest of the Tremaine Trust, the same organisation Reverend Fortescue had served for years. There were handwritten notes in the vicar's own tidy script, annotations in red ink, and most damning of all, a draft letter addressed to the bishop. "I can no longer remain silent. Misuse of parish funds is not simply a moral failing, but a crime. I intend to bring this to light, regardless of the consequences." Barnes looked grim. "So the vicar was planning to expose something?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and someone very much wanted to stop him." That afternoon, she returned to the vicarage to find Beatrice sitting alone by the drawing-room window, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "She's really gone," Beatrice said softly. "I don't understand it. Margaret was always proud, aloof even, but not the sort to flee." "She had secrets, I think," Miss Marple replied. "Secrets that connected her to the vicar's disappearance. Perhaps not as the instigator, but certainly as a witness." Beatrice turned to her. "Do you believe she was involved?" "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that someone close to her was, and that she was afraid the truth would come out." "Do you think she's in danger?" "I think she already was," Miss Marple replied, "and that's why she vanished." There was a long silence. Then Beatrice stood. "I must prepare for evening prayer. Even without Julian, the church still stands." Miss Marple nodded, watching her closely. As Beatrice left the room, Miss Marple returned her attention to the letters recovered from the dispatch box. One name stood out repeatedly: Graves, a solicitor in nearby Milchester. The vicar had written to him several times. She would pay him a visit, but not before one final stop, Margaret's bedroom. The room had not been touched since morning. Miss Marple stepped inside quietly, scanning the surfaces with a trained eye. She opened the wardrobe, checked the dresser drawers, then lifted the lid of the writing desk. Inside was a small velvet pouch, and in it a ring, a man's ring, plain and gold, with 3 small keys attached. She turned it over. Inscribed on the inside, J.F. Julian Fortescue. Miss Marple drew in a slow breath. Margaret had kept the vicar's keys, hidden them, perhaps stolen them. She now knew 3 things with certainty. Reverend Fortescue had uncovered a serious betrayal. Someone close to him had buried that truth, literally. And now that someone was growing desperate, desperate people, she knew, were dangerous, and there was still one more secret to unearth in Lower Tilling. Chapter 5. The Solicitor's Silence. The next morning broke clear for the first time in nearly a week. The mist that had clung to Lower Tilling had lifted, revealing the village with startling clarity. Its grey stone walls, crooked chimneys, and winding lanes suddenly distinct, almost unforgiving in the sunlight. Miss Marple sat in the back of a hired motor car, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, as the driver took her east toward the market town of Milchester. She had written the night before to request a meeting with Mr. Alistair Graves, solicitor. It was he, mentioned so frequently in Reverend Fortescue's dispatch box, who seemed to hold the final piece of the puzzle. The vicar had written to him multiple times, and yet, Miss Marple noted, Graves had never appeared in the village since the disappearance. What, she wondered, had kept a trusted solicitor so silent? Milchester was a compact town built around a cathedral green. The streets were bustling with delivery carts, cyclists and villagers out to take advantage of the fair weather. The motor car pulled up before a modest Georgian building bearing a brass plate. Graves and Holloway, solicitors. Miss Marple ascended the steps with quiet determination. Inside, a young clerk showed her into a cool wood-panelled office that smelled faintly of ink and lemon polish. Alistair Graves rose as she entered, a thin man in his early 60s with a high forehead, rimless spectacles, and an expression of polite wariness. "Miss Marple," he said, "I must admit, your letter came as something of a surprise." "I dare say much has been surprising of late," Miss Marple replied. "Especially for you, Mr. Graves." He gestured for her to sit, and offered her tea, which she declined. "Understand you were legal adviser to Reverend Fortescue," she said briskly. "And yet you have made no inquiries following his disappearance. That seems odd." Graves adjusted his spectacles. "It is not my place to interfere in an ongoing police matter, Miss Marple. But surely it is your place," she said mildly, "to speak up when your client has been attempting to bring to light serious financial misconduct involving parish funds, and when he vanishes days before making that public." Graves stiffened. "You've seen the contents of the dispatch box, then?" "I have." He folded his hands. "Very well. Yes, Reverend Fortescue came to me several times in confidence. He believed rightly, as it turned out, that the Tremaine Trust was embezzling funds earmarked for village restoration and church upkeep." "And he planned to expose them?" Graves nodded slowly. "He had gathered sufficient proof. We were preparing a statement for the bishop's office, and possibly the press. It would have caused considerable scandal." and who stood to lose the most? Graves hesitated. Colonel Archibald Tremaine, the head of the trust and an influential man, and possibly others who benefited in smaller, less direct ways. But you'd Margaret Fortescue be among them? The solicitor paused. She had no official role. But Reverend Fortescue had recently discovered that she had opened a private account in Milchester. He suspected that funds had passed through it. Miss Marple leaned back slightly. How curious. I believe she left the village quite suddenly 2 nights ago. Graves looked genuinely startled. She left? Without a word. Her valise gone, the window open, no note. I dare say she feared exposure. The solicitor frowned. Then she may well be in danger herself. Miss Marple rose. Yes, Mr. Graves. That is precisely what concerns me. Miss Marple returned to Lower Tilling by early afternoon. The sunlight had taken on a colder quality, casting long shadows across the vicarage garden. She passed the yew trees thoughtfully, pausing near the old stone bench where she had once sat with Reverend Fortescue years ago during a Sunday fete. He had been a quiet man, thoughtful and precise, and he had not deserved this end. Inside the house, she found Beatrice in the study, seated by the fireplace with a blanket around her shoulders. She was staring into the cold grate, her expression far away. You're back, Beatrice said without turning. Did the solicitor tell you anything useful? Yes, Miss Marple replied, enough to confirm that your vicar was a very brave man. Beatrice's eyes closed briefly. I always feared this would come to something terrible. When Julian began speaking of corruption, of betrayal within the church, I tried to urge him to be cautious. But he said silence was the same as complicity. Miss Marple nodded. He was quite right. Beatrice looked up, her expression haunted. I should have done more. You did more than most, Miss Marple said gently. You brought me here, and that may yet save another life. She hesitated. Do you know if the Colonel has been in the village lately? Beatrice frowned. No, I haven't seen him in months, though he and Margaret exchanged letters. She never let me read them. Miss Marple nodded slowly. May I ask one more question? Do you know when Margaret last went into the church? Beatrice hesitated. 2 nights before she disappeared. She said she wanted to pray alone. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes grew sharp. That, she thought, had not been prayer. She returned to the church that evening, walking alone across the flagstones. The vestry door opened easily now. The constable had arranged for it to remain accessible during the investigation, and she moved into the shadows with practised ease. Lantern in hand, she descended the narrow stairs into the crypt. The soil where the dispatch box had been found had settled again, tamped down by the constable's men. But now her attention turned elsewhere. To the far wall, it was slightly darker than the rest, the stone newer. She had not noticed it before. She stepped closer, ran her hand across the mortar. There, a seam. With care, she pressed her fingers along the edge. A panel gave way. Behind it, nothing but blackness. Miss Marple lifted her lantern, and the light flickered across something pale. A face. For a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Then she stepped closer. It was Margaret Fortescue, alive unconscious, but breathing, bound, a cloth over her mouth, wrists tied. Miss Marple turned on her heel and hurried back up the stairs. 10 minutes later, she returned with Beatrice and Constable Barnes. Margaret was carried from the crypt and taken into the vicarage. A doctor was summoned. She had a bruise along one temple and a mild concussion, but she would recover. Miss Marple stood with the constable by the church door. "She was trying to flee," Miss Marple said. "But someone caught her. Likely that same night I saw a figure move past the church." "Any idea who?" Barnes asked. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Yes, and I think it's time we paid Colonel Tremaine a visit." Chapter 6. A Visit to Tremaine House. The next morning dawned hard and clear, the fog finally gone, leaving behind a sharp brightness that seemed almost inappropriate for a village steeped in secrets. Lower Tilling looked crisp and lovely, but its beauty was like that of a porcelain vase, smooth on the surface, brittle underneath. Margaret Fortescue remained unconscious but stable, the doctor having assured Miss Marple that she had suffered only a light blow and mild shock. It would be some time before she could speak of what had happened to her in the crypt, assuming she chose to speak of it at all. Miss Marple, however, had no intention of waiting. By mid-morning, she was seated once more in a motor car beside Constable Barnes as they journeyed through the gently rolling countryside toward Tremaine House, the estate of Colonel Archibald Tremaine, a man whose name had hovered like a shadow over the case from the beginning, but who had remained suspiciously absent. Tremaine Estate was a cold, imposing place, more fortress than home. Built of grey stone and surrounded by manicured hedges clipped into unnatural perfection, the house exuded a kind of precision that suggested discipline bordering on obsession. Miss Marple, for her part, noted the black drapes in the hallway, the spotless windows, the stiff-backed maid who answered the door. It was not a house that encouraged comfort. Colonel Tremaine met them in the study. He was a tall man in his early 70s, broad-shouldered and heavy-jawed, with the kind of clipped moustache that seemed to bristle when offended. His uniform jacket hung on a nearby peg, and he wore his reputation as solidly as he wore his waistcoat. "Well," he said, looking down his nose at them, "what is the meaning of this?" Constable Barnes stood firm. "We have reason to believe you may have knowledge relevant to the disappearance of Reverend Fortescue." Tremaine scoffed. "Nonsense, the man was unstable, left of his own accord, I'm sure." Miss Marple's voice was soft, and yet his body was not found in Paris or Plymouth, Colonel, but buried in the floor of the old crypt at St. Luke's, wrapped in canvas and laid over with stone. That's not the method of a man taking himself off to the seaside. "The Toucheur," Colonel's face darkened, though he tried to appear unmoved. "Is that so?" "It is," Miss Marple continued, "and I think you already knew that." There was a long silence. The Colonel stepped to the decanter and poured himself a finger of brandy. "Would you care to explain what exactly you're accusing me of, Miss Marple?" "Of silence, Colonel, at the very least, and possibly far more." He sipped slowly. "And on what grounds?" "You were the chair of the Tremaine Trust. Funds were being misappropriated. Reverend Fortescue discovered this and was preparing to expose it. He had already sent documents to his solicitor, documents implicating not only the trust, but those associated with it. The Colonel set down the glass with a controlled click. All conjecture. But Margaret Fortescue knew, Miss Marple said softly. She was receiving payments, possibly unknowingly at first, but she knew before the end. Perhaps she confronted you. Perhaps she tried to run, but someone stopped her. Tremaine's jaw tensed. She's my goddaughter. And that, Miss Marple said gently, might have been why you didn't kill her. But you couldn't let her talk either, so you hid her, just as someone hid the vicar. Constable Barnes shifted beside her. Do you deny involvement in the vicar's death, sir? I do, Tremaine snapped. I was in Scotland the week he vanished. You'll find my name in the hotel ledger at Kinross Hall. Ask anyone. Miss Marple nodded. And did you happen to send anyone to Lower Tilling during your absence? Domain said nothing. Miss Marple pressed. You didn't need to wield the shovel yourself, Colonel. You merely needed someone loyal to do the necessary work. Someone who'd served you before. Someone like Mr. Simmons, the butler who worked here for 15 years before taking a quieter post at the vicarage. Tremaine's face gave the smallest flicker of reaction. Miss Marple continued. You knew the vicar had uncovered your misuse of funds. You knew he was gathering evidence. And you knew Margaret was becoming nervous. But it was too late to silence the solicitor, so you silenced the man instead. Perhaps Mr. Simmons confronted him in the vestry. Perhaps it was a scuffle. But afterward there was a body and a crypt in need of sealing. You have no proof, Tremaine said, though his voice was less confident now. I have enough, Miss Marple said, rising. And if I don't, I shall have it soon. Constable Barnes stepped forward. Sir, I'll have to ask that you remain available for further questioning. We may seek a warrant to search the estate and interview Mr. Simmons at length. Shh! Colonel nodded stiffly. You'll find nothing here. But Miss Marple had the distinct impression that they already had. Back in Lower Tilling, the vicarage was quiet. Margaret had regained consciousness but was still groggy and disoriented. Miss Marple sat by her bedside, observing the girl as she stirred. After a moment, Margaret opened her eyes and blinked. You? Miss Marple smiled gently. I'm afraid so. Margaret tried to sit up, winced and settled again. I was in the vestry. I meant to leave the village, but I had to collect something first, something I hid. What did you hide, my dear? Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. Uncle Julian's keys. I found them the day he vanished, in the grass behind the church. I knew something was wrong, but I panicked. I was ashamed. I hadn't known what the trust was doing, not really. But when he told me, I couldn't pretend any more. I was afraid the Colonel would ruin me if I talked. So you took the keys? Margaret nodded weakly. And I went back to hide them. That's when someone hit me. I never saw who. Did you remember anything else? A voice, she whispered. Deep, familiar. He said, you shouldn't have come back. Then, nothing. Miss Marple patted her hand. You've remembered enough. Rest now. That evening, Miss Marple returned to the church one last time. She stood in the nave, her hands folded neatly, staring up at the stained glass windows glowing with the last light of day. The mystery was not yet entirely solved, but it had narrowed to a point. She heard the familiar footsteps behind her, "I thought I might find you here," said Constable Barnes. Miss Marple turned. "Well?" she asked. "We interviewed Mr. Simmons. He cracked within an hour. Said he'd buried the vicar's body on orders, wouldn't say whose. But when we asked him what he was promised to keep quiet, he mentioned a pension, funds coming from the Tremaine Trust." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "So, it leads back to the Colonel, after all. We'll arrest him in the morning." Miss Marple looked up at the window once more, where the figure of a robed saint held a torch aloft. "I suppose justice comes eventually," she murmured, "even in places where it hides for a while beneath stone and silence." And in her heart she knew, though the vicar's voice had been taken, his truth would still be heard. Chapter 7. A cold arrest. It was just past 8 in the morning when Colonel Archibald Tremaine was arrested. The sound of the motor car arriving at Tremaine House echoed sharply down the gravel drive, scattering birds from the hedges and prompting the curtains to twitch in neighbouring cottages. News travelled fast in Lower Tilling, and by midday the entire village would know that the Colonel had been led from his home, still in his dressing gown, with a police inspector at each side. Miss Marple, seated calmly by the vicarage hearth, with her embroidery, merely nodded when Constable Barnes arrived to give her the news. "He said nothing?" she asked. "Not a word," Barnes replied. "Didn't resist, didn't confess. But he looked furious, like a man not used to being told no." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Well, such men rarely are." Barnes sat, looking troubled. "I'll admit it's strange. He never tried to run, never even denied it properly. Almost like he's still holding something back." Miss Marple's needle paused. "Yes," she said, "that's precisely what troubles me too." Because though the Colonel's silence was damning, there remained threads that hadn't been pulled. Who had delivered the blow that killed the vicar? Was it really Simons, as he now claimed? Or had Simons been covering for someone else? And more importantly, what had truly been the motive? Certainly, there was the matter of the Tremaine Trust and the misappropriation of church funds. But Miss Marple had dealt with many criminals, and she knew greed was rarely so simple. Money was often only the surface layer. Beneath it, resentment, revenge, fear, or love. It was love often that made murder particularly inconvenient. Margaret Fortescue was recovering slowly. She had been moved into the vicarage's sunlit upstairs room, and Miss Marple now spent a portion of each morning sitting with her. "I never meant for it to go so far," Margaret whispered on the third day. "I thought if I said nothing, it would pass." "But secrets," Miss Marple said gently, "rarely disappear on their own. They settle in like damp under floorboards." Margaret looked up, her face pale. "It wasn't the Colonel who hit me. I know his voice. It wasn't him." Miss Marple nodded. "Then who?" "I don't know, but he was younger, a softer voice, not local. Outsider, then," Miss Marple mused. "Or perhaps someone we haven't properly noticed." Left Margaret to rest and returned to the study. The documents from the dispatch box were still being reviewed by the bishop's legal advisers, but Miss Marple had requested copies of several. Among them, a list of financial recipients from the trust. Most were charitable causes, upkeep of old buildings, repair funds, parish schools. But one name, faint and handwritten in the margin, stood out. E. Harcourt. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. That afternoon she paid a visit to the village records office. It was tucked behind the post office, manned by an affable clerk who was more than happy to let Miss Marple rifle through the parish registers. "Harcourt?" she murmured, tracing her finger down the faded pages. "Edward Harcourt, assistant, curate, 1912, left under unusual circumstances." She turned the page. A brief, handwritten note had been added to the margin. "Resigned due to incompatibility with senior clergy. Rumoured scandal. No formal charges." And below that, in fainter ink, "Deceased, believed drowned 1913. Body never recovered." Miss Marple leaned back. So Reverend Fortescue had known of Edward Harcourt, had found payments linked to his name. A man long thought dead. But what if he wasn't? What if Harcourt had disappeared once before and had returned? Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple found Beatrice in the sitting-room, reading a letter with trembling hands. "This arrived just now," she said, holding it out. It was addressed to Miss Beatrice Lonsdale, written in a thin, slanted hand. Miss Marple read the first few lines and sat down slowly. "My dear Beatrice, if you are reading this, then you have seen through the veil of this place. You always were the clever one. I never meant to draw you into this, but your presence made it inevitable. I did what I had to. For truth, for legacy, for him. You mustn't blame the Colonel entirely. He was a pawn, useful, loud, and brittle. The real work was always mine. Shall not meet again." E.H. Beatrice looked stricken. "E.H. Edward Harcourt?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I rather think so. But I also think he never drowned." Beatrice's voice dropped. "But he'd be over 70 by now." "And yet some shadows age slowly," Miss Marple said, "especially when cloaked in borrowed names and quiet corners." She stood. "I think it's time I paid a visit to someone I have rather overlooked." The churchyard was still and quiet by dusk. Miss Marple moved with steady purpose past the rows of weathered stones to the rear of the church, where a modest cottage abutted the grounds. The sexton's lodge. She knocked once. The door opened slowly. Mr. Partridge, the groundskeeper, looked at her with faint surprise. "Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion," she said. "I wondered if we might speak." He stepped aside wordlessly. Inside, the cottage was sparse but tidy. A fire crackled in the hearth, and an old kettle hissed gently on the hob. But what caught Miss Marple's eye was the framed photo on the mantel. A younger man, wearing clerical robes. "Is that you?" she asked, stepping closer. Partridge hesitated. "No." Miss Marple looked at him carefully. "It's Edward Harcourt, isn't it?" He sat slowly. "You should leave, Miss Marple." "I think not. Because the Reverend Fortescue found your name in the Trust's ledgers, found out you were receiving funds from the Colonel, and then he found out who you really were." Partridge Harcourt bowed. His head. "He confronted you," she continued. "You begged him to keep silent, but he wouldn't. So you followed him that night to the church." Harcourt's voice was low. "I didn't mean to kill him. He slipped, hit his head. I panicked. Simons helped me hide the body. We thought if Margaret fled, it would cast suspicion elsewhere. But she came back." "And you struck her too," Miss Marple said quietly. "Yes." Silence. "You could have left," she said. "Started again." "I did," he said, "twice, but sins always find their graves." He stood and held out his wrists. "I won't run again." Chapter 8. The Echo of Confession, the arrest of Edward Harcourt, alias Mr. Partridge, sent ripples through Lower Tilling that no one could ignore. The village, already unsettled by the disappearance of the vicar and the scandal of Colonel Tremain's downfall, now reeled with a deeper, more personal shock. That the quiet, unremarkable man who had tended the graves for the last decade had once been a clergyman himself, and a murderer. Miss Marple watched it all unfold with the quiet detachment of someone who had seen the worst of human nature hidden behind the most ordinary smiles. But even she, seasoned as she was, found something particularly tragic in the tale of Edward Harcourt. He had been a man destroyed not by malice, but by shame, and by secrets too long buried beneath the weight of pride. At the vicarage, Margaret, Fortescue had recovered enough to sit upright in bed, propped by pillows and sipping weak tea. The colour had returned to her cheeks, though her eyes remained haunted. "I remembered," she said quietly to Miss Marple, who sat beside her with a small basket of knitting. "When I was struck, just before it happened, I heard him say, 'You always take the wrong keys.'" Miss Marple looked up. Margaret continued, "I didn't understand it at the time, but I think he didn't mean for the vicar to die. It was me he'd been watching. I'd found the ring, the keys. He must have been watching us all for weeks, waiting." Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "He feared the truth would come out, and when it did, he tried to control how." Margaret looked down at her teacup. "He was kind, you know. When I first arrived, quiet, helpful. I never suspected." "Kindness and guilt," Miss Marple said softly, "are not so far apart as people think. Some people are at their gentlest when they have something to hide." There was a pause. "Did he ever speak to you of Reverend Fortescue?" Miss Marple asked. Margaret nodded. "Once. He said the vicar was too modern, too ready to stir the water. He said tradition was a fragile thing, and that people like Julian broke more than they mended." Miss Marple smiled sadly. "And yet, I suspect it was the vicar who was trying to mend something Mr. Harcourt broke long ago." Beatrice Lonsdale had taken to long walks through the churchyard each evening, her figure a silhouette among the yew trees, moving slowly between the graves. She was not mourning, exactly. It was something quieter than that, an effort to process betrayal, to come to terms with how closely danger had passed beside her without her knowledge. Miss Marple joined her on one such walk. "I trusted him," Beatrice said softly, her eyes on the stones. "Not Harcourt, Julian. I believed he was strong enough to withstand whatever the trust threw at him." "He was," Miss Marple said, "but he didn't know how far some people would go to preserve the lie." Beatrice stopped walking. "What happens now?" "Colonel Tremain will face charges for conspiracy and financial fraud. He may not have wielded the spade, but he buried enough truth to sink a dozen reputations. And Harcourt will answer for the vicar's death and Margaret's attack." Beatrice turned, her face pale. "Do you believe in redemption, Miss Marple?" The older woman considered for a moment. "I believe," she said carefully, "that people carry the weight of their choices to the end. And if they seek forgiveness, they must carry that too." They walked in silence for a few more steps. Then Beatrice said, I've decided to leave the vicarage." Miss Marple looked over with surprise. "Truly?" "I've received a letter from a girls' school near Bath. They need a housemistress, a quiet post, but purposeful." She gave a wan smile. "And I think Lower Tilling has seen enough of me." Miss Marple took her hand. "I believe, my dear, that Lower Tilling has seen the best of you." The bishop's office sent an official representative to the village the following week, a stern-looking man with spectacles and the complexion of one unused to country air. He offered a careful statement to the parish council. A new vicar would be appointed within the month. The Tremaine Trust would be dissolved. Restoration funds would be re-evaluated. There was no mention of Edward Harcourt. The villagers, in their quiet way, understood this as a signal that some truths would remain politely unnamed. Miss Marple, however, received a letter. It came from the prison in Wansley, penned in a precise, elegant hand. "Dear Miss Marple, I am told you are the one who saw clearly through the fog I created. I find myself oddly grateful for it. There is a kind of peace in finally being known, even if the knowing is not kind. You will, perhaps, not believe me when I say I never intended Julian's death. It was an accident, a cruel twist of timing. I came to silence him, yes, but only with persuasion. What followed was panic and fear and 30 years of shadows that finally caught me. I do not ask for forgiveness. Only understanding H. Miss Marple read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in her case. Understanding, she thought, was not always comfort. One late morning, as she prepared to leave the vicarage and return to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple stood for a long time in the little church. The pews were empty. The morning light spilled through the stained glass in warm threads of red and gold. She approached the altar slowly. There, beneath the lectern, was a small brass plaque freshly affixed to the stone floor. It read simply, "In memory of Reverend Julian Fortescue, a shepherd who stood for truth, died in faithful service. 1952, she rested a hand on the stone." "Poor man," she murmured. "You deserved better, but the truth has a way of climbing up through the cracks, doesn't it? Even when people try to lay stone over it." Behind her, the great doors creaked slightly in the wind. Miss Marple turned to go. There were 2 chapters of this story yet to unfold. Questions still unanswered. Why had Harcourt resurfaced at all? Who, truly, first arranged the payments in the Trust's ledgers? And what was the one piece of Reverend Fortescue's notes that remained missing? But all in good time. Miss Marple had learned that justice, like tea, is best served when allowed to steep. Chapter 9. The Letter That Wasn't Sent. The village of Lower Tilling had settled into a strained calm in the days following Edward Harcourt's confession. A funeral was held for Reverend Fortescue, his ashes interred beneath the yew tree where he so often walked. The parishioners came in quiet clusters, some grieving, some merely curious, but all subdued. Miss Marple, now a familiar and respected figure in the village, had not yet departed. She stayed, not out of sentiment, but because one detail still troubled her. One piece remained conspicuously missing, and she knew, by instinct more than fact, that it mattered: the missing letter. Among the documents retrieved from the vicar's dispatch box, there were multiple drafts, scattered notes, and marginalia. But the final version, the one he intended to send to the bishop, had never been recovered. Edward Harcourt had not mentioned it, neither had Colonel Tremaine, and Miss Marple could not help but wonder, had someone intercepted it? She decided to begin where the letter might once have ended, at the bishop's office. Miss Marple's arrival at the diocesan offices in Chudbury was met with the usual polite surprise reserved for determined elderly ladies with impeccable posture and unexpected questions. "I'm inquiring," she told the secretary in a tone that brooked no contradiction, "about a letter that Reverend Julian Fortescue may have sent in the week before his disappearance, addressed to the bishop personally, on matters of church finance." The secretary, a thin woman named Miss Elston, blinked behind horn-rimmed spectacles. "We received no such letter, madam, and I open all the bishop's personal correspondence. No envelope, no partial postmark, nothing delayed?" Miss Elston shook her head. "Nothing, I'm afraid." Miss Marple inclined her head graciously. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." But as she stepped out into the brisk air of Chudbury, her mind was already elsewhere. The letter had never arrived, which meant one of two things. Either Reverend Fortescue had never posted it, or someone had taken it before it left the village. Back in Lower Tilling, she called once more on Simons, the butler. He had remained under a sort of supervised house arrest, confined to his modest cottage just outside the village until formal charges were finalized. The police no longer considered him the primary threat. Harcourt's confession had seen to that, but his role in covering up the death was still under scrutiny. He received Miss Marple with stiff dignity. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said. "I find loose ends troublesome," she replied, taking a seat. "I wanted to ask you something about the day the vicar disappeared." Simone sighed. "We've been over that, Miss Marple." "Yes, but not this particular thread." Her voice remained mild. "Did you ever handle the vicar's outgoing post?" Simons blinked. "Occasionally. If he left something for collection, I'd see it to the box. But not always. Some things he preferred to send himself." Miss Marple nodded. "Did he mention posting anything urgent that day?" "No," Simons said slowly. "But he was agitated, very quiet over breakfast. He locked himself in the study all morning. You entered the study afterward, did you not?" Simons looked uncomfortable. "Yes, to tidy. Did you see any letter, on the desk or the bishop's address?" Simons hesitated. "There was something, a sealed envelope, not yet posted. I assumed he'd left it for the afternoon run." "And did you post it?" "No," Simons admitted. "By the time I returned, the envelope was gone." Miss Marple sat back. "Gone?" He nodded. "I thought he'd taken it with him. To town, perhaps. But now I wonder." Miss Marple rose. "So do I." The sun was low by the time Miss Marple returned to the vicarage. A coppery light flooded through the windows as she sat by the cold hearth, thinking. The letter had vanished before the vicar left, or rather, before he was killed. It had not been mailed. It had not been found among his effects. That meant someone had taken it. Someone who had access to the study. Someone trusted. She glanced at the small rosewood cabinet by the fireplace, still untouched since the vicar's death. Beatrice had kept it locked, uncertain what should be disturbed. Now, with her blessing, Miss Marple opened the top drawer. Inside were prayer books, old correspondence, and a stack of parish leaflets. She leafed through them slowly. And then, tucked between two newsletters from the year before, she found it. An envelope unsealed, addressed in the vicar's hand. To the Bishop of Chudbury. Private and confidential. She drew it out slowly. The contents were still inside. She unfolded the letter with care. My Lord Bishop, this may be my final attempt to convey the seriousness of what I have uncovered regarding the Tremaine Trust. I believe the matter extends not only to mismanagement, but deliberate and criminal misuse of diocesan resources. Colonel Tremaine is complicit. However, I must also raise concern about a recent financial beneficiary not recorded in official trust minutes. One E.H., a man I now suspect to be Edward Harcourt, presumed dead since 1913. I believe Mr. Harcourt is living under an assumed name and position. I further believe he has re-entered church life under false pretenses. Please act swiftly. My life may be in danger. Yours in faith, Julian Fortescue. Miss Marple's breath caught. So he had known, not only about the trust, but about Harcourt himself, and he had feared for his life, yet someone had deliberately hidden this letter. But who? She heard a footstep behind her. Beatrice stood in the doorway. You found it, she said softly. Miss Marple turned. Yes, hidden in your late cousin's cabinet. Beatrice's eyes were dry but dark. I thought I was protecting him. He was already gone. And that letter, if it had been seen, would have caused scandal. It would have destroyed the church's name in Lower Tilling. So I tucked it away. Miss Marple rose. And let the bishop think there was no warning. Beatrice's face hardened. He's dead, Miss Marple. Julian. And what difference would it make now to drag the whole parish through a public disgrace? The people here want peace, not another scandal. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then quietly she said, Truth and peace, my dear, are rarely the same thing. That night Miss Marple sat by her window, the soft rustling of the trees beyond the glass, whispering in the wind. She watched the moon rise over the bell tower of St. Luke's, pale and luminous in the dark. She now knew who had killed Reverend Fortescue, who had buried him, who had silenced his voice. But the question that troubled her most, who had allowed it all to happen, still echoed. And as she drifted into uneasy sleep, one truth remained. There was still one shadow left in Lower Tilling, and it hadn't yet stepped fully into the light. Chapter 10. The Quiet That Followed. Lower Tilling, in the weeks that followed, began to breathe again. It was not the same breathless innocence as before, of course. Villages, like people, do not emerge unchanged from dark chapters, but the parish carried on. The bells of St. Luke's rang once more on Sunday mornings, though the congregation remained a little quieter, a little more reflective than before. The pew where Reverend Fortescue had once stood remained empty for the time being, marked by a single lily. Miss Marple, her case concluded, prepared to return to St. Mary Mead. Her valise was packed. Her gloves were buttoned. And yet, on the morning of her departure, she delayed her carriage by an hour, for there was one last visit she intended to make. She called once more on Beatrice Lonsdale. The drawing-room of the vicarage was bright with spring sunlight, but Beatrice remained by the fireplace, half turned from the light, her expression unreadable. "You're leaving," she said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "I dare say I've lingered longer than was polite." Beatrice did not smile. "You came to ask if I'll send the letter." Miss Marple's head tilted. "I came to say farewell. What you do with the letter is your own affair." Beatrice turned. "I've read it a dozen times. I keep wondering what Julian would want." "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "he would have wanted the truth to be known. He gave his life for it." Beatrice sighed. "He was always so unyielding. He believed right and wrong were things you could dig up like weeds. He didn't believe in grey." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Grey is only white in shadow, my dear. The sun always moves eventually." There was a long silence. Then Beatrice reached into the folds of her cardigan and produced the letter. The original unsigned draft that Reverend Fortescue had meant to send. "I'll forward it to the bishop," she said, "with an addendum of my own." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Then perhaps your vicar may rest." By midday, Miss Marple's carriage stood waiting in the drive, its brass fixtures gleaming in the pale light. Margaret Fortescue stood at the gate, her arms still in a sling, watching with a mixed expression of gratitude and guilt. "You saved my life," she said as Miss Marple approached. "I dare say you did some of the saving yourself, my dear," Miss Marple replied. "It takes courage to live with the truth once you've learned it." Margaret looked down. "I was blind. I let others make decisions for me. First the Colonel, then Harcourt. I thought it was simpler that way." Miss Marple's expression softened. "It's always simpler, child, until the moment it isn't." Margaret met her eyes. "And if I wanted to make amends for what I ignored, what I allowed?" Miss Marple touched her hand. "Live well. Speak plainly. That is more difficult and more valuable than penance." As the carriage wheels turned onto the lane, Miss Marple looked back once. The vicarage stood like a monument to truths long buried, its windows now thrown open, its shadows shrinking. 2 days later, in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlour, surrounded by familiar comforts: a ticking mantel clock, the scent of lavender polish, and the sound of the kettle beginning to boil. She had received several letters since returning, one from the bishop, thanking her in measured ecclesiastical terms, another from Beatrice, now formally resigning from her post and accepting the schoolmistress position in Bath, and one more, unsigned. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. The handwriting was thin and slanted. Inside, a single sheet: "Miss Marple, the truth is a prism. You see one side, others see another. I buried a man who had already been buried long before I laid him in the crypt. Julian Fortescue was righteous, yes, but he was also cruel. He exposed the Colonel not only for justice, but for pride. He forced Harcourt's hand. He forced mine. Does that excuse the crime? No, but it explains the silence of those who did not stop it." Miss Marple folded the letter slowly. She placed it in her writing desk, in a compartment marked simply "Unfinished." She poured herself a cup of tea and looked out the window at her rose garden. A pair of finches chirped in the hedge. The world, it seemed, continued turning, but some mysteries, she thought, did not end with a hangman's noose or a signed confession. Some drifted just out of reach, like the final breath of a candle. You could know who had done it, and still wonder why. She sipped her tea, savouring the quiet. The truth had been uncovered. Justice had been served. And yet in a corner of Lower Tilling's past, a whisper would always remain.